Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. So, in a past video, I discussed some of the reasons or goals villains might have that would explain why they want to go up against the whole world. What I didn't explain is how a villain might succeed at doing so. And I should note that villains have a lot more options in speculative settings than they currently do in real life. Thus, while the first two options in this list are shared in common with the real world and are therefore more grounded, the later options are gonna get wild. Number 1. Armed Conquest. If it worked for Alexander the Great, it can work for your villains. Conquerors throughout the ages have expanded their territory and subjugated their neighbors by sending in armed soldiers who convince the locals to bend the knee through violence, threats of violence, massacres that set examples, and occasionally they'll go and defeat another set of conquerors and declare themselves the liberators instead of a new set of overlords. I'd recommend against using that last circumstance unironically during an active story if you want your villains to stay villainous. But you could use it in the backstory to help explain how the villain established a large power base. Regardless of their methods, in almost every corner of Earth, you'll find stories about great warriors and conquerors who are noble, dastardly, or both, depending on who you ask. Some of them are mythical, some of them are wholly mundane, but more often than not, they're a mixture of both, a fact that makes them very easy to use as a basis for a literary character. However, something that you should keep in mind is that the nature of war and conquest changes depending on the era. In ancient times, a single city-state could dominate its neighbors or carve out an empire, but it wouldn't last for long. In classical times, new bureaucratic and administrative techniques allowed empires to last much longer and depend less on the capital. In medieval times, religious wars led to vast conquests and forced conversions that reshaped cultures and the nature of intercontinental trade. In the modern post-nuclear age, direct warfare between large nations is too dangerous for anyone to attempt. And so instead, the major powers use clandestine support and proxy wars to increase their influence. I bring this up because your villain should be a prime example of a conqueror of the era your setting emulates. And while that usually means they ought to be charismatic and well organized, the tactics they prefer can vary wildly. Number 2. Political infiltration. Sometimes the real threat is not the person on the throne, but instead it's the person standing behind it, regarding the throne with covetous eyes. While some villains will sweep into a nation at the head or in the rear of a massive army, others will rise through the ranks of a government until they reach just the right spot to either manipulate everything from the shadows or else perform a bloodless coup without the need for any civil wars or pitched battles. Now, the methods that a villain can use to infiltrate the halls of power depend entirely on how the government functions. In a democracy, the infiltration method is fairly straightforward. You start a populist movement by making sweeping promises you know you'll never fulfill. You gain financial support from shady businesses and politicians. You run for the highest office, and then you start changing the laws in ways that cement yourself and your followers in positions of power. That last part can involve cheating the vote, suppressing the vote, jailing political rivals, or declaring martial law and ending the vote entirely. In a monarchy or other autocracy, your villain's options are going to be a bit more murderous. In some nations, the villain would have to start out as part of the royal family or otherwise have some claim to the throne. But in other nations, it would be enough for the villain to be a powerful general or advisor, someone who people would want to take over if the entire royal family were to somehow die off or disappear. And that is exactly what will happen. Everyone who could stand between the villain and ultimate power within the state will end up being discredited, disinherited, disappeared, poisoned, assassinated, or otherwise removed from any possibility of wielding power. Number 3. Doomsday Device. Ah yes, the Doomsday Device. A classic plot device used by authors of every kind of speculative fiction there is, including the varieties that are supposed to be more grounded in reality. But then I suppose in a reality with civilization-ending nuclear arsenals, doomsday devices aren't as far-fetched as they used to be. Regardless, the advantage that a doomsday device provides is that a villain can run a much smaller and less exposed operation in order to get one. Whereas with Conquest, the villain has to get an army from somewhere, and with political machinations, the villain has to be exposed to other politicians who are also vying for power. A Doomsday Device is something a villain can develop in a secret lair, far away from the rest of the world. Now, as for what the villain plans to do with the Doomsday Device, that all depends on what their ultimate goal is. But, assuming that goal isn't to destroy humanity or the world itself, they probably plan on using their device to hold the world hostage until their demands are met. They might ask for money or power, or they might ask for some political or societal change that otherwise wouldn't happen unless the world were at stake. Or maybe the villain is completely crazy and will ask for a bunch of nonsense demands or impossibilities that no one could ever fulfill. The main point of the Doomsday Device here is that the world, or at least all of humanity, are being held hostage, and the heroes have to do something about it. Number 4. Transformation. Instead of destroying everyone, maybe the villain's goal involves changing everyone into something else, something new. However, because the person with this goal is the bad guy of your story, this transformation should be negative in some sense. Maybe the villain has some misguided belief that they can force humanity to evolve, but what they're actually doing is removing something important, like empathy, imagination, or the ability to feel pain. Or maybe the villain wants to de-evolve humanity, even though that's not a thing, so that we stop being harmful to the environment. Another option would be for the transformation to be universally positive, but only for the lucky individuals who survive the process. If the process is lethal to a significant percentage of those who undergo it, and yet the villain doesn't give their subjects a chance to say no, then that is definitely a reason to call them the bad guy. Or even if the side effects aren't death, but just disfigurement or brain damage. Either way, the villain is hurting people and needs to be stopped. Yet another option is that the villain is intentionally disfiguring or disabling people, so that they and their followers will be superior by comparison. They essentially want to create a sort of underclass that will have no choice but to serve them, or else they want to remove a special capability that one fantasy race or alien species has that gives them an advantage. Something like the special elven connection to magic, or else the Krogan birth rate in the Mass Effect series. Number 5. Mind control. Maybe the villain is the kind of person who wants the whole rest of the world to follow their commands, whether they like it or not. Or maybe their goal is to create a sort of hive mind with themselves and maybe their closest allies as the dominant personalities. Or maybe their goal is a bit more reasonable than that, and all they really want to do is control a few strategically chosen minds just long enough to get all of the money and power they've always wanted. Regardless of the purpose, mind control can work along a few different vectors, depending on how dangerous and how obvious you want the mind control to be. For instance, you could have the mind-controlled people be physically replaced with more compliant versions, like the old movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Or maybe there's some sort of mind control parasite that can be destroyed to release the victim's mind. You could have a device that allows its user to control minds, and then if that device is destroyed, then every victim is instantly released. Or maybe there's some sort of brainwashing going on, and the victims will need months of deprogramming, followed by years of therapy before they can be fully freed of the controller's influence. Distance can also be a variable. You might require that a person be around the mind control agent in person and stay in contact for several days for it to take effect, or else the villain might need some piece of a victim, like a lock of hair or a blood sample. You could also have the device work on everyone, everywhere, once it activates, in which case the heroes would need to stop it before it could turn on, or otherwise be immune to its effects for one reason or another. But regardless of how fast it works, your best bet is to make the mind control work on the same scale as the story you plan to write around it. And if you're writing a mind control incident for your setting's backstory, then, well, you can make the scale as big or as small as you want. Number 6. Divine Destruction. There are two ways to understand the term divine destruction, and your villain could potentially go either way with it. Allow me to explain. The first interpretation is destruction wrought by divine forces. In other words, the villain plans to anger the gods to the point where they destroy the world, or they plan to unleash a destructive god, or they plan to ascend to godhood so that they can smite the world themselves. And maybe destruction or smiting isn't their overall goal, but in general, when you decide to shake up the cosmic status quo, you're going to end up breaking something important. The other interpretation is destruction wrought upon divine beings. The villain hates the gods, or godlike beings that exist in your setting, and wants to destroy them. Maybe they think the gods are too arbitrary or meddlesome. Maybe they hate the way the gods limit ambition. Or maybe they serve one of the gods and they want to eliminate some of the competition. Regardless, the battle between gods is going to be dangerous. However, the scope of that danger is going to depend on just how powerful the gods of your setting are, or godlike beings, depending on if you lean more towards fantasy or science fiction. If the beings in question are just extremely powerful but otherwise normal sapient creatures, then the battle is going to be dangerous to any mortal caught in its radius, but otherwise, the universe will keep moving. If the beings are things like personified stars and planets, then the fighting is going to have some cosmic consequences that the heroes should try to stop. And if the gods are literally the forces of the universe and the emotional states of humanity, then the death or birth of a new god could render the entire universe unrecognizable. Every good villain should have both a motivation for changing the world, or at least their corner of it, and a path they can take that will make that change happen. And it's a good idea to keep these two things separate, because if one of them is not clearly bad or villainous, while the other one is, it can make the villain much more complex, while keeping the conflict simple. A villain whose motive is reasonable, but whose method is destructive, will be sympathetic to both the audience and the protagonists, while a villain whose method seems reasonable, but whose motive is selfish, can fool the heroes into supporting them, until they figure out the villain's true intentions. So while there's nothing wrong with creating a straightforward villain, by separating methods and motives, it's much easier to make them complex. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.